Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is March 13th, 2018, and we are so incredibly excited to be interviewing Dr. Tara Westover, author of this phenomenal book, which is sweeping the nation by storm. The book is called Educated, a Memoir by Dr. Tara Westover. It is published by Random House, Penguin Random House, who is not an insignificant author or publisher. It's a very big book. And Tara's been on all the big shows. She's been on like 30 different podcasts, and we're not offended at all that we're number 31. We're honored. We're honored that you would join us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, Tara Westover. So where are you joining us from?
I'm in Cambridge in the UK.
Okay, so you're in your apartment. Excellent.
I'm in my house, yeah.
All right. Well, this book is an incredible book, and I've read a lot of books. I've read a lot of memoirs, especially written by Mormons, and this book was a gut punch in many instances, and then in many instances it was very inspirational and powerful and uplifting. So, congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
Today we're going to be taking 2 hours, and we are going to cover as much of your story as we can. We are excited to have listeners joining us live. Listeners, please share this interview right now on your Facebook wall. Promote it, and we'll have as many people as possible tuning in. In addition, we just want to make a really quick announcement, let you know that Mormon Stories Podcast has several cool events coming up. We do workshops and retreats all over the country. We're looking to do something in Boise very soon. Colorado Springs is also interested. If you're interested in a Boise or a Colorado Springs or Denver event, please message us at mormonstories@gmail.com. But we do have events coming up. We have a Mormon Stories retreat June 8th through 10th in Salt Lake City. We have a retreat in Houston, July 13th through 15th. And then in August, we have Idaho Falls, 10th and 11th. And then our cruise to the Bahamas, October 24th to 28th. You can find all this information at mormonstories.org/events. And the only reason we mention it is because one of the main objectives of Mormon Stories Podcast and the Open Stories Foundation is to support people who are going through a religious transition, who are struggling in their faith, struggling with their families, struggling in their marriage or in their significant relationships, raising kids, dealing with ward, friends, etc., people that feel lonely. And we do these workshops and retreats to support people who need that help. So if you're interested in any of those events that I mentioned, they're always rated 4.9 out of 5. People love them and say they really help. Please check out mormonstories.org/events, and we'd love to have you join us. And if you want us to host a workshop or retreat in your area, just email us at mormonstories@gmail.com, and we'll get something scheduled. And the only other thing I'll say is that Mormon Stories is brought to you by the people that donate to the podcast. If you enjoy these episodes, if they make a difference in your life, if you want to see more interviews like this, like with Tara, with Tova Mervis or others, please donate. You can go up to the top right of mormonstories.org, click on the donate button. Monthly donations allow us to plan, to hire staff, and to make financial obligations that are more medium to long term. So please sign up. $10, $20, $50, $100 a month, whatever you can afford, allows us to keep our staff employed, allows us to pay our bills, and to keep providing support for people who need it. So please check us out. And also check out our new website. mormonstories.org has recently done a web redesign thanks to the support of Jeremy Cargill. And we would love to have you guys give us your feedback on if you like the site. We tried to add a few cool things like a top 25 most important, most popular interviews. We have other lists like top 10 LGBT themed episodes, top 10 women or feminist themed episodes, top 25 faithful episodes, episodes on race, episodes on truth claims, on church history. There's even a bucket for my favorite episodes. There really aren't any favorites, but there are a few that I've listed just to encourage people to check them out. So we've tried to make the website useful for you, so check it out. All right, without any further ado, Tara Westover, thanks so much for joining us again. Let's dive in, shall we?
By all means.
Okay, so we're going to get to why you wrote the book and what your motives were, but in typical Mormon stories fashion, what we want to start with is just your story, and we want to go as chronological as possible. And there will be times maybe when I take us out of the narrative, but as much as we can, I want to try and capture your life in about an hour, hour and a half, and then open it up to lots of questions from our live viewing audience. So if you don't mind, let's begin. Can you talk anything about your pioneer heritage and to what extent you are, like many of us, sort of hailing from Mormon pioneers of one stock or another, or do you even know?
I know a bit about it. There's a story I do tell in the book about a I think three greats, grandmother of mine, who was from Norway, and she was converted in Norway and converted her parents. And then they had dreamed to come to the United States and meet the prophet. But when they were able to do that, they actually weren't able to take the whole family. So the parents went and she stayed behind with her fiance. And well, what happened was her mother was so sick by the time that she made it to Salt Lake that she was dying effectively. And it was one of her last wishes to see her daughter. So she was sent for immediately and didn't make it before her mother passed away. But of course, now she'd left her fiance in Norway. They were separated. He was too poor to come. And she was too poor to live in Zion without, now she was just a burden to her father. And so she became a plural wife. And it was not a very happy story. The way it was told to me as a child was that she was the second wife. The first wife was unable to have children. So when she had become pregnant with twins, it had caused a lot of tensions to the point where she worried for her safety and the safety of her children. And so she had fled in the middle of the night, and one of her children didn't survive the winter because it was too cold. And it was quite a brutal story, actually, but also a beautiful story of faith and family, but also, I think, presented a side of polygamy that was not ideal. It was told to me as a faith story as a child. My mother told it to me that way, but I remember really being quite upset by it.
Sure, yeah, those pioneer stories can be brutal. Any other pioneers worth mentioning, or sort of Mormon ancestry?
I had my great-great-grandfather on my other side, Charles Westover, joined the handcarts and converted, I think, at winter quarters and came over, but I don't know a lot of details about him.
Okay, well, let's talk about in the book. You talk a bit about your grandparents, maybe even your great grandparents. Let's talk about that just a bit.
My grandparents, both of my grandparents were pretty normal LDS people, really. They were fairly mainstream, very mainstream for Idaho. On my mother's side, they lived in the middle of town with a white picket fence and a yellow house, and they were just very typical Mormons. My grandmother had a father who was an alcoholic, and I think she had felt a bit judged and isolated in the community. So for her own children, she did everything she could to create this kind of appearance and actuality of respectability. So they were very, very respectable, mainstream people. My father's side were a bit more wild, kind of mountain farmer type people, but mainstream, I would say, in terms of theology.
Okay, so your dad and mom play so heavily in the book and in the narrative. Talk about what influences on both your dad and mom might have shaped the way that they ended up raising your family and parenting each of you, because it was not a typical upbringing.
No. As a child, it seemed typical to me. There were a lot of things that I thought were really beautiful about my childhood. We grew up I grew up on this beautiful mountain in southern Idaho, and we had a farm that belonged to my grandfather, and we had a junkyard that belonged to my father, full of crumpled up cars. And my mother was an herbalist and a midwife. We spent a lot of time walking on the mountain, gathering rose hips and mullein flowers and yarrow that she could stew into tinctures. So there's a lot of beautiful things about it. And of course, it was the only life that I had ever known. So it seemed completely normal to me. Now that I'm older, I can see that it wasn't exactly normal. There were actually many aspects of it that were pretty unusual.
And that's an understatement. So what do you think shaped your dad's, and we'll talk about mental health, but there's just sort of survivalist, kind of off the grid, prepper kind of impulse with a lot of, conspiracy theories, sort of New World Order, Illuminati, um, framings that your dad brought. And I'm a relative of Ezra Taft Benson, so I know that a Mormon who was raised in the '60s might have come by a lot of that New World Order conspiracy thinking, honestly. So do you have a sense for what made your dad kind of grab onto that? Was it his parents? Was it his...
It wasn't his parents. That's what's interesting about it. I know that in the 1960s, there was a big emphasis on food storage and on the end of times and all of that. But I don't know, everyone else in our town had also lived through that same period. And yes, there was a certain conscientiousness about preparedness and food storage, but nobody was like my dad. So I don't know what it was exactly. I mean, when he married my mother, they had their children in a hospital. They put them in school, their first three sons. They got birth certificates for them. Everything seemed to be going pretty normally. It was really only around the time that my third and fourth brother came into the world that my dad started to get more radical. He wanted to have a midwife because he started to develop a kind of suspicion or skepticism of the medical establishment. And then that suspicion spread to the public school system, and he pulled the kids out of school. So that by the time I came along, I was the youngest of seven. Me and the last four, really, none of us, we never went to school. We never set foot in a classroom. We were all born at home. We were never taken to the doctor, no matter how seriously we were injured or if we were ill. Broken bones was the only exception to that I can think of. And of course, we didn't have birth certificates.
Right. So, I'm just touching back a bit. Like I do remember, and this may be stuff you haven't ever heard of, but there were these books that were written in the '60s, like None Dare Call It Conspiracy or The Naked Communist, that really did make their way around, and they were tied to the John Birch Society, and it was stuff that Ezra Benson even got in trouble for promoting. So much of what I heard from your dad, I got exposed to in the '70s as a devout Mormon. So I guess I get a sense that you have never been able to have a talk to him about what his influence is, whether it was books or general authorities or friends or brother, siblings or associates. You don't know. And it sounds like what you're saying is that increased over time, that he didn't
I
maybe
think
start
while
out
other
that way.
people moved away from it in the 70s, 80s, 90s, everyone else was moving away from it, and he was moving toward it in a
Okay.
way. So
Yeah.
I think that you're right in saying, he did get mailings from the John Birch Society. I do remember that. And he did take certain talks given by Ezra Taft Benson, David O. McKay. He took them really seriously. But it's not as though there was no one else in his family that was doing this. I
Right.
don't think that he had other friends doing it. Other people in our ward were not. It was kind of like, you had this period. I think America was gripped by fear, really, McCarthyism and all the rest of it, anti-communism. It wasn't just in the 60s you had this period, but what was kind of interesting about my dad is, he starts, I think that they were married in 74, and I don't think he began to radicalize until, really into the late 70s. So it's kind of at the time when the rest of Mormonism is kind of starting to move away from this, is when
Yeah.
he really starts to double down on it and starts to get these kind of ideas that if the Illuminati has infiltrated the government, they might also have infiltrated the church. And so maybe even some of the brethren know how wicked the public schools are, but they're not going to say, because they're trying to test the faithfulness. Like, that's when he started to get really conspiratorial about it, at a time when most people were moving past that.
I'm assuming he graduated from high school.
Yeah, he went to it's called West Side. It's a high school in Idaho near where my family lives.
What kind of basic major city was kind of near?
There's not really one. If you drive an hour, you can get to Logan.
Okay, so you're kind of an hour north of Logan, is that right?
Yeah, roughly.
So north of Franklin and Preston, kind of that area?
Yeah, that area.
Okay, but south of, I guess, Idaho State, whatever that, Idaho Falls or
Yeah,
whatever that is.
definitely. Somewhere
Okay,
between Idaho Falls and Salt Lake.
got it.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
where we are.
Okay. So did your dad do any college at all?
I never knew that he did, but one of my brothers just told me recently that they think he did a semester or two of college. My mom definitely did. She actually, quite ironically, was going to be studying or was studying early childhood education before she met my dad. I think she wanted to be a teacher, which, considering their views on public education, is kind of interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I'm going to ask you a ton of questions that the book answers, but I'm interviewing you as if I haven't read the book, even though I've read 90% of it. So forgive if I ask you questions. Expect questions that the book answers, if that's okay. So, did your dad serve a mission?
He did serve a mission. He went to Florida.
And do you have any stories about what that might have been like for him, or?
I know he had a difficult time coming back. I think he's not someone who likes to travel. He's not someone who deals with change very well, even at the best of times. So I have heard stories that it was a really difficult time for him, but I haven't heard he wasn't one of those people who told a lot of stories about his mission.
Okay. And do you have a sense for how he was treated by his parents and what his childhood and adolescence might have been like?
My grandfather was a difficult man. He was a man with a temper, for sure, and we all saw that and we all knew that. It wasn't a secret. But it was one of those things, he didn't talk a lot about it. I don't think that he was very close with his mother. I don't think he was terribly close to his siblings, and I don't think he was close to his father. And yet they never moved away from each other. So they lived at the base of this mountain, and then when he grew up, he put his house pretty much very close to theirs, and they just always lived together despite not particularly being close.
Okay. And so was it a farming upbringing for your dad? Did he work on a farm, or
Definitely worked on a farm.
do you know what they were
I think a
farming?
lot of his,
Like
I don't remember what they
potatoes
were
or
farming.
hay or
My
alfalfa?
grandfather had horses for a lot of the time, and I think that they were running livestock. But I don't know exactly when that stopped, but there was a point probably when my dad got older that they stopped doing that.
Okay. And so but your dad did go to public schools. He did serve a mission, maybe a little bit of college.
Yeah.
And he had siblings?
He had two sisters.
Okay. All right. How about your mom? It sounds like your mom might have been rebelling a bit by marrying your dad. Talk a bit about how that might have been true, or am I wrong?
I think, well, it's been my speculation, based on the stories she told me. So she had this very respectable upbringing in town with this kind of perfect house. My grandmother was, again, I think she felt like she had been judged quite a bit for not coming from the right kind of family, and she wanted to correct that for her own daughters. And I do think that my mother rebelled against that. So that when she met my dad, who by that time was I don't think he was a radical, but he was definitely a bit unorthodox. I think she was really drawn to that.
Okay. And did they ever talk about their courtship or anything like that? How he wooed her?
A little bit. Mostly when my mother would talk about it, yeah, she would talk about the contrast between how she had been raised and kind of taking care of nice clothes, or just in general not being rowdy, and then the kind of contrast of my dad kind of blazing in with jeans, which her mother never allowed her to wear jeans apparently. And so she I don't know, I think that that movement from a city to the country, from respectability to rowdiness, I think really just appealed to her.
So you got a sense that she kind of knew what she was signing up for?
Well, no, because I don't think he had any of the beliefs that he would later develop. I think
Okay.
he was a slightly unorthodox eccentric person, but I don't think he was saying, oh, doctors are dangerous, and if you take a pharmaceutical, then you're
Yeah.
compromising your spirituality. Like, I don't think he thought those things.
Yeah, because you did seek medical help in public schools at the beginning. Your family did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my oldest brother was born in a hospital, and he went to school. My oldest three brothers went to school.
So do you have any sense for what changed your dad? What kind of, is it fun? Did he become more fundamentalist? Do you ever call him fundamentalist? Just not in a polygamy way. Just,
I don't call him fundamentalist because with Mormonism, there's such a strong association with polygamy. If
yeah.
it weren't for that, then I probably would. But I feel like that gives a slightly wrong impression, just
But
because that's how people have defined it. If you defined it, though, as having a radical interpretation of doctrine, then he certainly meets that criteria.
of doctrine. Okay. Now this hits me there. Something you wrote at the intro of your book hit me like a ton of bricks. And it almost made me feel insecure.
Oh dear.
Author's note. Okay. And I've highlighted it. Author's note. This story is not about Mormonism. Neither is it about any other form of religious belief. In it, there are many types of people, some believers, some not, some kind, some not. The author disputes any correlation, positive or negative, between the two. Please explain that.
Well, I do not think that my father is representative of the Mormon faith. Like, I don't
Okay.
think that Mormonism is the reason that we were raised the way that we were. It's always been my position that, again, I think that my dad has a mental illness, bipolar disorder. This is something I would discover when I was in college, just the concept of mental illness and what that means. And it seems very clear to me that my dad was I think that the religious extremism was a vehicle for that. So I think that the bipolar disorder caused the religious extremism and not the other way around. That's just been my view of it. So it's not as though Mormonism has nothing to do with the story. There's a lot about Mormonism. I go to BYU. I was raised Mormon in one sense. But I I did think it would be unfair to say, especially to the wider world, you know, I mean, my book, I knew at the time I wrote that my book was being translated into 19 languages. I feel like it would be very easy for people to say, well, this is a Mormon upbringing, and her father is representative of your typical Mormon. I think it would be so easy to make that jump. And I really wanted to, as much as I could, say, no, not really. My dad is not indicative of Mormonism. I think he's indicative of a lot of other things, but I don't think that you could say Mormonism.
Yeah. So I think I totally understand that. And one approach could have been to say, hey, this represents a more conservative or fundamentalist type of religion. So please don't judge all Mormons by this story. But you kind of went further and said any correlation. And I'm just wondering if that was just to try and not turn readers off or protect Mormons, or if you really believe there's no, I guess you've already said it. You do see that there were heavy religious influences in your upbringing, right?
I think that statement disputes the idea that religion makes people good or that religion makes people bad. I think people can use religion as an excuse for goodness or for badness.
Got it.
And I think certainly religion can introduce psychological elements into a culture that are great and also equally that are very bad. So I don't say that it's completely innocuous, and I don't say that it's completely impotent.
Got it.
But I do think that very specifically says there are good people and then there are less good people. And I don't think that the correlation should be those who believe and those who don't believe. Because I got to BYU and I had wonderful experiences I had people at BYU who literally saved me.
Yeah.
And it would seem ungrateful in a way to suggest that, well, they're just good people and has nothing to do with their belief, and then just blame the religion for everything else. Just seems slightly unfair.
Yeah. You didn't want to throw Mormonism under the bus.
No, I think it's an influence, but I don't think you can say it's any one kind of influence.
Yeah. Got it. Okay. So, do you have any idea of what made your dad start changing? Was there a head injury? Was there trauma? Was it just the progression of what you later described maybe as possibly bipolar disorder? Were there any factors that might have been an impetus to this transformation for him this radicalization, as you call it?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, it's been a speculation of mine that he has bipolar disorder, but I'm not a medical professional. I have no
Mhm.
idea. I do know when I learned about bipolar disorder that the age of onset did correlate with when he started to do things like hire a midwife to deliver his children or pull his kids out of school or just stop filing for birth certificates, other things that most people kind of do. So I've speculated that it probably was just it just happens to people, you know. I mean, that there's an age where that happens, and he was that age.
And was he trying to pursue a certain career that went south or anything like that? Or, you
As far
know,
as I know, he was logging. I think it was physically demanding, but I don't think it was, you know, I don't think it was any kind of trauma. I know he had an illness and some kind of issue with his stomach, and the doctors were not able to figure out immediately what was wrong, which again I think is something that a lot of people go through. I don't think
yeah.
everyone would experience that and come to the conclusion that the doctors
Yep.
were not trying to help, that they were actually trying to harm you, and then from there that they were part of this larger conspiracy. But that was what he did.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about your childhood. How, what were the best and the worst parts of your childhood growing up?
Well, I think the best parts, a lot of them had to do with the mountain, with playing on the mountain, or we had horses. We broke horses, which was a pretty adventurous, and also it could be kind of fun. It could be kind of scary. I think it was a quality of my childhood that it had this kind of duality, that the things that were beautiful in one moment could be kind of terrifying the next. So the junkyard could be this amazing exotic playground, but it could also be pretty terrifying because my dad didn't really believe in safety equipment, and that I think was another product of whatever mental irregularity he has. He just did not understand risk. He did not understand. I just don't think he was able to comprehend the risks he was putting anyone in, including himself. And so that could be really terrifying. And then of course, even after someone was injured, there was you couldn't go to the doctor or hospital because that was not allowed. So there was a sense of adventure and of beauty and of a lot of autonomy and independence, but then there was a lot of risk involved with that.
Did you have fun with your siblings growing up? Were you
I
guys pretty
did
close?
mostly.
Because it sounds like
I,
you didn't have a lot of friends outside of your family, right?
no, because I mean the kids at church I very much thought of as public school kids, and in my mind, yeah, I don't know, I guess I thought we were living a better way than they were. And I think equally they judged me quite a bit because I didn't go to school. So they very much stayed together, and I was more on the outside of that. So I was never invited to their houses or anything like that. The adults in the community though were very, I think that they tried quite a bit to reach out to us.
Yeah. So any your closest friends as a child and in
Definitely my
adolescent,
siblings.
your siblings. Were you closest to anyone in particular?
I was really close to my older brother Sean, but only when I was older. And of course, a lot of the book is taken up with him because he was, as I said, there's this kind of duality to my life where he could be really kind, he could be really sensitive. There was a time he saved me, really. We were breaking horses, and he was on a horse that had never had a rider on it before, and I was on another horse that just went completely berserk, and he really risked himself by whipping that horse into a frenzy to basically come save me on the other horse. So he could be really self-sacrificing, but he could also be really controlling, really violent, really manipulative.
Yeah, I also felt like the scene, what was it called? The claw or the chopper? What did you call
The
it?
shear.
I mean, that was a harrowing scene. Talk about that if you don't mind.
So my dad had this piece of equipment. We had a lot of angle iron, basically several 100,000 pounds of it that needed to be cut in order to be sold. And my dad came up with the idea that the way we would cut it, he didn't want to use a cutting torch because he thought it would be too expensive. And again, this I think just really shows how his mind works. So somewhere he found this thing that he called the shear, and it was essentially a 2-ton pair of scissors maybe it was only 1 ton. It was heavy. Pair of scissors that just, it would operated on a wheel, so it just chomped, chomp, chomp, and you'd feed the metal through it and it would buck like crazy, and you would try to kind of not get thrown into the blades. And my brother, Sean, really sacrificed a lot to work that shear all summer, because otherwise my dad was going to have me do it.
Yeah, and there's a scene in the book where your dad's trying to force you to do it, and just like 5 minutes prior, talk about what happened to your brother.
Well, it had taken a big chunk of flesh out of his arm, and he had had to run to the house with kind of blood gushing. And I think these stories are difficult to tell in a way, because I think people want to assume that my dad just didn't care about our safety, that he was just indifferent to it. And I don't think that's true, because, yeah, we all got hurt in the scrapyard because he took these reckless measures, but nobody got hurt really worse than he did. And so I think it was a real tragedy of mental illness, because he was running the scrapyard. He didn't have the ability to evaluate risk. Even after someone was hurt, I don't think he was able to understand how serious the injuries were. And so these just terrible things kept happening. And, with him, he was this was my senior year at BYU. There was a car he wanted to crush. And if you're going to sell a car to the car crusher, you have to take the tank off. They won't take it otherwise. It's too dangerous. So what anyone would do is drain the fuel, puncture the tank, and drain the fuel out. And then you can take it off any way you want. You can get a cutting torch. You can remove the belts. You can just take it off. But he didn't do that. He got a cutting torch and started removing the tank while it was still full of fuel. And of course, a spark made it into the tank and the car exploded. And he was burned terribly from that. And my family, because of the way they are, because of the beliefs that they have, they made the decision to treat that burn at home. No IV, no morphine, just on the sofa with my mom, made a salve out of comfrey and lobelia, and that's how they treated it.
And when I've heard you in other podcasts kind of describe your dad and these sort of unsafe conditions, originally I just thought it was lovely that you were trying to not throw him under the bus, and also trying to contextualize it in a sense of mental illness. But in the book, there's such a heavy theme of abuse, honestly, especially as it relates to your brother Sean, and you having to work through this tendency to make excuses for people and deny and downplay and even question yourself. And I guess as I hear you try to kind of give context for your dad, I wonder if that plays in a little bit even there.
Maybe, but I don't think you have to let someone off the hook just because you question their mental integrity. Like, I don't think it's a very fine thing that we were all working in that scrapyard, whether he was insane or not, whether he had a mental illness or not. I think that shouldn't have happened. It
Sure.
shouldn't have been like that.
It's
So for me, I think that I need that information that he had some kind of mental issue, because it's the only thing that squares the circle for me. I'm pretty sure that my father loves me. I've always felt that he did. And yet we were constantly getting hurt, and he was constantly putting us in danger. And for me, it makes sense to say, well, he just wasn't able to do this. And I really believe that that's true. I don't think it makes it not abuse. I think people can abuse other people and not mean to. I think you can abuse people you love. I think usually when there's abuse that takes place, it's between people where there's actual love. So I don't think it excuses it in any way to say, mentally, I don't think he was able to. I don't believe he was in his right mind. So to me, I don't think it's an excuse. I don't think it excuses it in any way. I think it's just a fact.
right. Some of the things I wrote down around safety, that, seat belts would be taken out of cars, seats in the van would be replaced with the mattress, and the kids would just sleep. There are two really heart-wrenching scenes where you get in car crashes. Do you want to talk about those?
Yeah, we got into the first one, I think, because my dad insisted that we drive all night, and no one else thought that was a very good idea. And then my older brother, I think he was 16 at the time,
It was Tyler, right?
Yeah, and he was driving and he fell asleep around 6 in the morning, and we hit 2 telephone poles, and then we only stopped when we hit a tractor. And my mother's head hit the windshield, and she had a traumatic brain injury. There's no doubt. She had 2 giant swollen black eyes, and those eyes were black and swollen for weeks, which of course, if you have 2 of them, they have a medical term for that. It's called raccoon eyes, and it's a sign of traumatic brain injury. And of course, by then my dad was very skeptical of doctors, and so she was never taken for a CAT scan. She never saw a doctor. So it was a stupid accident that shouldn't have happened, and then there wasn't proper medical care given after.
And then the second one was almost as scary or worse than the first.
The second one was just my dad driving 60 plus miles an hour through a snowstorm where everyone else had pulled off the road. And again,
he's speeding up, and he's saying the angels can go faster than what did he say?
I think he said a half in jest, like, I never drive faster than the angels can fly. But he also really believed nothing. I think he really did believe nothing would happen that God didn't want to have happen. And this is not a rational thought. I don't think this is a Mormon thought. Not that people really do. I mean, people maybe say this, but they don't then play Russian roulette with it. So, but we did. And I think, again, I don't think that he was mentally in his right mind when he made those decisions. I just don't think so. He was in that car as well.
Yeah. And how did it end up?
Well, we crashed. I know it's shocking for you to hear, but we crashed. Mostly everyone was okay. I think I was the only one. I was knocked unconscious for a few minutes and had a kind of whiplash injury for quite some time after that.
And it sounds like you woke up like they had left and you were kind of alone. And
well, they were looking for me. They thought I'd been thrown out of the van because they couldn't find me. And it had turned out I was just underneath the futon. The seats had been taken out, and there was just a futon mattress in the back. And somehow everyone else had ended up on the top of it, and I ended up on the bottom. So they couldn't find me. They thought I'd been thrown out of the van.
Yeah. And something we forgot to mention is in the first wreck, you end up with power lines on the car. Is that right? Like,
yes,
you can't make this stuff up. This is crazy.
Well, because we smashed through 2 telephone poles.
Yeah.
So we were taking some of them with us, I guess.
Yeah.
No, they were bad accidents. They weren't casual accidents. They were really bad accidents, both of them.
And what was also super coincidental was that both happened when you made these trips to Arizona related to your dad's mental illness. Talk about why you would make these trips to Arizona.
Well, he would go to Arizona to see his mother, because she would go to Arizona, my grandparents, for the winter because it was too cold for them in Idaho. So, and he wasn't that close to her, but he would go occasionally. And he would go, another reason he would go is that I think he had pretty serious seasonal depression. So when the winter set in, he would find it really hard to even get out of bed for some weeks. And then my mother would say, right, let's go to Arizona. And I think that the downside of that is we would go and we would get there just fine. And then the sun would kind of restore him, and it would send him into this kind of euphoric manic phase where nothing bad could ever happen because he didn't believe anything bad could ever happen. And then he would make really poor safety decisions that would end badly.
And because the cars weren't registered or insured because he wanted to be off the grid, that made it extra a safety concern, because you don't want, tell us why that made it more unsafe and complicated. Because what happens, the wreck happens, what's his reaction?
Well, he usually didn't want to get the police involved, but I mean, I don't think that's surprising. If you're not going to go to a hospital, you're not going to want the cops there. What are they going to do except give you a ticket? And so, yeah, I sometimes wonder if I think the cars weren't insured as a way of protest or registered as a way of some kind of like government protest. I don't think he thought that the government actually couldn't find us or something, because, we had power, we had all these other things that you need to live. So I don't really know why he thought that not registering the car was an important step, an important line to hold. I don't know.
Let's talk about your mom. Let's talk about her participation in midwifery and I guess alternative medicine.
Yeah, so I think that was something she got into very much probably in response to the fact that my dad became so anti-doctor. I think she looked into herbal supplements to help him sort out whatever was going on with his stomach. And that just progressed. As he got more and more anti-doctor, my mother developed more and more skills with herbalism, with homeopathy, with energy work, and ultimately with essential oils. And so, I mean, I think sometimes it would happen, someone would have an illness and we didn't go to the doctor. Some mother would research what to do for it herbally, and pretty soon she was doing quite a lot of business with that on the side.
Talk about your dad's remedy for swollen tonsils.
So that did happen when I started singing, and my dad was really proud of the fact that I could sing. And he got pretty invested in giving me advice about singing and how to sing and what to sing and where to sing. And there was one winter where I kept getting strep throats. I think I must have had tonsillitis or something. And I just kept getting them. And my tonsils were really swollen. And my dad, discovering that they were really swollen, for some reason came up with this idea that sunlight was the perfect cure for tonsillitis, and that if you would just stand outside literally with your mouth open, just hold it open so the sun could shine into it, that would cure it. So I did that probably 30 minutes a day for a month, which in Idaho in January is actually not good for tonsillitis. I think we should be clear. Does not help.
Yeah.
And it also gives you a hell of a jaw ache.
Yeah. I'm just imagining a little girl standing with their mouth open in this Idaho winter sun.
Pretty great.
Yeah. Talk about the rescue remedy.
This was a homeopathic that my mother said would treat shock, and my family really believes in this still. I've never seen it work, the kind of miracles that they claim they've seen it work, but in my family they really believe in it. So the idea is, when someone would come in, my brother lit his leg on fire once and he was in shock, and we gave it to him then, or I'm sure they gave a lot of it to my dad because he was covered in a lot of kind of 3rd and 4th degree burns, really bad burns starting from his waist and going up. And I'm sure they, anytime anyone lost a lot of blood, was going into shock, she would whip out this homeopathic. And in my family, it's very much believed that it brings you out of shock. I don't know if I think that, but they certainly do.
What's in it?
It's homeopathic. It's mostly distilled water, and then there's a few drops of a mother homeopathic, which itself was mostly distilled water. So it's mostly water, I think. But some people really believe in homeopathy. I'm not one of them, so I'm probably not the person you should go to for a really good analysis of how it works.
And what types of oils would be in this?
My mother didn't do essential oils until later.
Okay.
So she would start out with, typical ones, lavender, chamomile, and then as she expanded outward, then she would get into some much more obscure ones. Yeah.
And talk about how these oils would be used to treat things that maybe a physician might not support.
I think you have something in mind from the way you're asking.
No. I mean, I wrote down that it just it seemed like sometimes they were used for things that maybe that didn't belong. So I don't have anything specific.
They were treated. Well, I would say it was just that the herbalism and the natural healing was just used for everything. So there wasn't a line at which my parents would say, in almost any case, this is too serious. I can't think of hardly any cases where that would happen. And so even if my mother suspected she had cancer or something like that, she would not go and get that looked at. It would just be solved at home. So pretty much
with essential oils or something to that
with essential
effect.
oils or homeopathics or energy work. So it didn't, if you were having trouble with your kidneys, if you had pneumonia, if you had, whatever. There was a time when I got to BYU when I'd never been to a doctor before. But my second year at BYU, I got really sick. I got really unlucky, and I got mono at the same time that I had strep. And I had a boyfriend at the time who did not know that I was raised by radicals. And so he just assumed that I would go to the doctor, and I didn't, because I was terrified of doctors. And finally, he kind of made me go, and I was given penicillin, which I assume must have been for the strep, because I don't think they can do much for mono. But my mother, when she found out that I was taking penicillin, she sent me this little care package. But everything that she sent me, there was clay to like, that you had to soak your feet in to draw toxins out of the body, I remember. But everything that she sent me was to fight the penicillin. So she sent me nothing for the actual mono or the strep. It was all for the penicillin.
Oh man.
Because that's what they were worried about. They were very concerned that I was taking penicillin. That was terrifying, whereas the illnesses were not terrifying.
Which many see as a modern miracle, penicillin, right?
Yes, certainly we don't. No, not us.
Was it your grandma who was undertaking chemotherapy, but was also taking herbs as a supplement? And then
Yeah, so my dad's mother did very much believe in doctors, and then when she got cancer, she would do some herbs, but she would also go to the doctor and do whatever they told her to do. And my dad had a belief that if he went to the doctor, I think he thought that compromised you spiritually in some way, so that the herbs wouldn't work. So you couldn't do both. If you had to have the faith healing and trust the herbs, which he called God's pharmacy, or you could do the doctor route. But of course, he didn't think that would work. But definitely, he was very skeptical of people who tried to do both.
right, yeah, and I guess I did write some other things that, you know, the concussions would be treated sometimes with some of these homeopathic or essential
Oh,
oil
definitely,
remedies.
always.
Yeah.
Yeah, always.
And I was always frustrated when you had that pain in your neck or that pain in your toe. Tell us about Sean's remedy.
Oh, I had a broken toe, which he had broken. And yeah, he just yanked on it and set it, basically. I
But
think.
also the neck. Tell the neck story.
Oh yeah. So from that second car accident, I did have a really serious neck injury, and I became kind of immobile, actually. I couldn't turn my neck at all, almost. And so, yeah, I don't know how he had learned it, but he got in the habit of just coming up behind me and just snapping my neck. And
But it's a lot more dramatic in
I
the
think
book.
it was super dramatic. If you can't move at all and then someone snaps your neck, I mean, you'll be dizzy for 10, 20 minutes. And
Did it help?
it did help a little bit. It helped a lot, actually, but he kept doing it even after that initial set had happened. And I think that was actually quite bad for my neck. You shouldn't, because he would just do it all the time.
Right.
So, yeah.
And then just while we're on it, tell the story about washing your hands in the bathroom, because it's a good story.
My dad didn't have the most normal ideas of hygiene. So he very much thought that it was just a waste of time. So my mother's mother, who was this very proper woman, again, she was the one with the white picket fence and the yellow house. And so she would get after him and say, well, don't you teach your kids to wash their hands after they go to the bathroom? And he would say to her, no, I don't. I teach them not to piss on their hands. So he wasn't a super big believer in soap or anything like that.
And that followed you to BYU with your roommates, right?
It did, yes. I was corrected. I was put right, I would say.
What happened? What did they say?
Well, they just noticed that I didn't and were horrified and sat me down and said, this is disgusting. You have to do this. Like, this is not optional.
Right. Okay, let's jump into the religious and spiritual life of your family when you were a child and adolescent. So in what ways was your family religiously typical? Would you even know? Like, well, you know, lots of people who were raised in sort of conservative or traditional or orthodox Mormon homes. What of your upbringing, Mormon upbringing, would people relate to?
So we went to a mainstream Mormon church.
Every Sunday, all
yeah,
3
every
hours?
Sunday. I got very mainstream Mormon education on Sundays. And then my dad would always sort of augment that with a slightly more radical interpretation later. So I think I have a pretty decent grip on mainstream Mormonism. And that's I would say I kind of almost converted to mainstream Mormonism when I went to BYU, because I had been raised in this much more extreme. My dog is dying I'm just going to let him out of the room.
That's fine.
1 second.
I'm gonna read a couple comments from our listeners.
Oh, please do. I'm just going to because someone came home and now he's desperate to get to them.
Yeah. Go ahead. No problem. Yeah, so I want to thank all our listeners for tuning in. We have 180 people joining us. We want to invite all our listeners to please post comments or questions on the feed, and we can check those things out and share them with Tara real time as much as possible. Do you remember? So did you go to primary every Sunday?
Yeah, absolutely. Sundays we were pretty mainstream Mormons,
So
except sometimes Dad would get up and kind of call everyone to repentance for not having food storage or for sending their kids to school or for whatever.
how did the kids treat you in primary? As the weird one or as a normal kid or?
Mostly as the weird one. There was some bullying, I suppose, but mostly I think they just ignored me. They didn't really know what to do with me, you know.
But I mean, you would have done 16 years in that ward before you went to BYU, 17 years almost. So I mean, that's a long time, 3 hours a week. Are you saying you were ignored for all those years?
I wasn't completely ignored. They would definitely talk to me, but I was never, and I don't really blame them for this because in a lot of ways I think we isolated ourselves. But I was never invited to a girl's house who went to public school until I was early teens, and even then almost never happened. So I never went to play at their house. They never came to mine. And if you think about what little kids, what they talk about, they were talking about cartoons, they were talking about teachers they had at the school, they were talking about school, and they were talking about TV, and they were talking about people I didn't know because I only knew them. And they knew all the kids in the other wards because they went to school together. So I just don't think that they knew what to do with me. And it's not like I was ever going to catch up. It's not like they could bring me into the circle and I would ever meet these people or know what they were saying, because I never would. So there was some teasing. There was a kid in the class who told people that because I was homeschooled, I couldn't read. And so he would taunt me quite a bit for being different. But mostly I think that it was not malicious. It just, we weren't included. And some of it was us. We were isolating ourselves. Like I said, I thought of them, when I say I thought of them as public school kids, that wasn't a compliment. I was judging them as well.
How did your family look at people who went to public schools?
Well, my dad would say that people sent their kids to schools because they were lazy, that they knew what God wanted them to do, but they were going to do the wrong thing because they weren't listening to the Spirit and all these kinds of things. So, yeah, I was very judgmental of them. It was not the case that I thought that I necessarily even wanted them to be friends with me, because there were moments I did because I was lonely, but there was a whole other part of me that would have not wanted anything to do with them either.
Do you remember any favorite primary songs?
I like Book of Mormon stories.
Really?
It's got such good rhythm.
Okay. What were your family spiritual and religious practices in the home?
We did, I think, we always had we had family scripture study every morning. We had family home evening absolutely religiously. That was just not optional. And on Sundays, we were not allowed to watch TV for most of the time I was growing up. Although most of the time I was growing up, we didn't really have a TV. We got that when I was much older. But, we sort of had to read the scriptures on Sundays. And I think our religion was probably more about what you didn't do than what you did do. Although we were definitely expected to pray and read the scriptures and all of that kind of thing.
What were the things you didn't do?
Well, like I said, doctors, hospitals.
Oh, I mean religiously.
All of the. Well, I think it was the same for my dad. In some ways it was a conspiracy theory, political paranoia, his fear of doctors, but it also had a really strong spiritual element. I would have thought that people who were taking drugs, pharmaceuticals were in a way sinning, and I would have thought it was sinful for me to do that. So, and same with schools. The moments that I did want to go to a public school, I always felt like I was making a mistake spiritually. It wasn't just that it was, politically my dad was against it. It was a spiritual thing as well.
You mentioned being shocked when a BYU roommate drank Diet Coke. So clearly Diet Coke was forbidden in your family.
Yeah, for sure.
Caffeinated, just any caffeinated soft drink.
Anytime that there was a more extreme version of Mormonism that my dad could go for, he did that.
And that included Sabbath observance, not buying things on Sunday.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Any
definitely.
other kind of really harsh, strict, I guess, modesty. So let's talk about this. So I was kind of appalled at just the use of the word horror. Talk about that in your family.
That was a word my dad would use a lot when he was talking about doctors and hospitals, and he would say that people were whoring after other gods. So that was a word he used quite a bit. And if people sent their kids to school, that was the way he conceived of it, that they weren't being true faithful Mormons and that they were worshiping these other gods. So that was the way my dad used it. The way that my brother used it against me specifically, I think he meant it in the definitional version of it. And I think it's hard in a way. I think it's a short step from demonizing sex to demonizing women, because if you say women trigger sexual thoughts in men and those sexual thoughts are bad, I think it's a really easy jump to say, well, women are bad, and if the sexual thoughts are dirty and the women are causing them, then the women themselves are dirty. And I think that was very much behind when my brother used it against me. Yeah, that was where it was coming from.
So tell a story or two where that word was used against you.
So my brother, he like I said, he could be great, but he could also be really
This is Sean,
controlling.
right?
Sean,
Sean.
I call him
Okay.
Sean in the book.
Yeah.
And he could be really great, but then sometimes he would get in these kind of moods where he just seemed to need to test his power, to kind of test his control over you. And what he would do is he would tend to pick some random errand that you could run. So what I remember doing a lot was he would say, get me a glass of water. And then you would, and he would say, no, I want ice in it. So you'd go get ice in it. And then you'd bring it, and he'd say, no, take the ice out. What is this shit? I don't want this. And you do this back and forth and back and forth. And not only with him making you do it again, but acting like you were somehow stupid for not having done it the way he wanted, even though he told you the other way. So it was this kind of game. And eventually, when you got tired of playing the game, sometimes he would go straight from that to angry and violent, but more often he would start engaging with you physically in some way that he was pretending was a game, as if you were all having fun, and he would be laughing. But while he was doing this, he wouldn't be doing fun things. He would sometimes choke you, and then it would escalate. At some point, it would almost always escalate to him grabbing me by my hair, hauling me down the hallway, and shoving my head in the toilet. And that is usually when the word made its appearance.
But it was also when you started liking a boy, right?
Yeah, like none of the violent behavior from him occurred until I was, probably 14, 15, maybe. Yeah. So.
And I think I remember in the book you just talking to a boy who actually liked someone else, maybe even your brother's girlfriend. But the point was he saw you talking to a boy. And didn't that lead to a very violent interaction?
Yeah, and I haven't psychologized him as much because for some reason, I'm less interested in why he is the way he is. But I do think there was something controlling there was a sense of ownership and control and hostility to the idea that I would like someone. And I think he liked me much better as a child. He was okay with me as a child, and I don't think he was okay with me as I got older.
Because there's this part in the book where I'm just reading along, and then all of a sudden you're like woken up and assaulted, and it came right on the heels of him, if I'm remembering right, seeing you talk to somebody or maybe trying mascara. And it was a really jarring part of the book because I had no idea why he was pummeling you, right?
Yeah, and I don't know exactly either. I've
You
always
just
felt
woke
with
up
him,
with him. You just woke
I
up with
just
him
woke up
pummeling you,
that
right?
way.
And
Yeah,
what did
I
he
think,
do? So you, like the night before, what happened, and
well,
then how'd you wake up?
nothing happened. That was what was so odd about it that I'm
Like he
aware
saw you
of.
talking to someone,
Yeah,
or
I think he saw me putting on lip gloss, and then I had been kind of flirting with this guy. We were in a play together in town, and I had been talking to this boy, and he didn't like it, and he told me he didn't like it. And I don't know if that's what upset him, or I don't know. I think with him, one of his girlfriends once said to me that what was remarkable about him is that he had this amazing ability to make other people hate themselves as much as he hated himself. And in those moments, that's exactly what it felt like. I think that was such insight on her part, because it never felt like it was about you. It always felt like it was about him.
but what did he do?
Well, that particular morning, he was choking me, and he was shaking. he was shaking me. So my brain was kind of, I don't know if you've ever had your brain shaken, but you really can't think when your brain is being shaken. You can't talk, you can't really even perceive things. It's just because your brain it's literally smacking into it within your skull, you know. I mean, it's not completely tight, your brain, it turns out, and it can, if you shake it, it really can't function.
Yeah. Do you mind, do you have your book with you?
In another room. I'm a bit embarrassed. No, I do have one here, yeah, but it's British, so it'll take me a second to find whatever page you're looking for.
Okay, so chapter 23, I'm from Idaho. I just kind of want to have you read what you wrote about the word horror, because it was really powerful, and it made me write a frowny face. If you look at the margins, I've got some frowny faces there.
Right.
That's what I write when I read something sad.
So what's the paragraph that you're thinking
So
of?
start by reading, my body felt heavy as I walked to my apartment.
And how far do you want me to go?
And maybe go to just 2 paragraphs. Maybe 3.
Okay. My body felt heavy as I walked to my apartment. All my life I had been taught that marriage was God's will, that to refuse it was a kind of sin. I was in defiance of God, and yet I didn't want to be. I wanted children, my own family, but even as I longed for it, I knew I would never have it. I was not capable. I could not be near any man without despising myself. I had always scoffed at the word whore. It sounded guttural and outmoded even to me. But even though I silently mocked Sean for using it, I had come to identify with it. That it was old-fashioned only strengthened the association, because it meant I usually heard the word in connection with myself. Once, when I was 15, after I'd started wearing mascara and lip gloss, Sean had told Dad that he'd heard rumors about me in town, that I had a reputation. Immediately, Dad thought I was pregnant. He should never have allowed all those plays in town, he screamed at Mother. Mother said I was trustworthy, modest. Sean said no teenage girl was trustworthy, and that in his experience, those who seemed pious were sometimes the worst of all.
Keep going, please. Couple more.
I sat on my bed, knees pressed to my chest, and listened to them shout. Was I pregnant? I wasn't sure. I considered every interaction I'd had with a boy, every glance, every touch. I walked to the mirror and raised my shirt, then ran my fingers across my abdomen, examining it inch by inch, and thought, maybe. I had never kissed a boy. I had witnessed birth, but I had been given none of the facts of conception. While my father and brothers shouted, ignorance kept me silent. I couldn't defend myself because I didn't understand the accusation. Days later, when it was confirmed that I was not pregnant, I evolved a new understanding of the word whore, one that was less about actions and more about essence. It was not that I had done something wrong so much as that I existed in the wrong way. There was something impure in the fact of my being. It's strange how you give the people you love so much power over you, I had written in my journal. But Sean had more power over me than I could possibly have imagined. He had defined me to myself, and there's no greater power than that.
Thank you. That was really powerful for me. This association, you'd only heard the word horror in association with you. Talk about the scene where you rolling up your sleeves while you're working for your dad.
My dad had really strong ideas about modesty, and I think in some ways it's interesting because I don't necessarily oppose the idea of modesty in a general sense. Like, I don't know as though it's great if people turn up naked to work, but I feel like it's incredibly difficult to teach modesty without placing responsibility for sex on women. And I think that in some ways my father's hypervigilance about modesty made me vulnerable to my brother putting that responsibility on me. So my dad he was constantly lecturing about what women in the town were wearing, or even speculating that they were intentionally trying to get attention from him based on what they wore. And I worked construction for him when I was 15, 16 years old. And I would wear these t-shirts. And if it was a hot day, I would roll the sleeves up just to hear, nothing scandalous. And they were tight t-shirts, so it's not like you could see anything. It was literally just the top of my arm. And he would just come around and just yank it down and say, this ain't a whorehouse, and keep walking.
And then you'd roll him back up and you'd yank him down kind of thing, right?
That was probably one of our first big standoffs where he clearly wanted me to do one thing and I did the other.
And then there's a really beautiful part of the book where you talk about how confused you were because he would criticize both tight-fitting clothes and loose-fitting clothes. No, but that was powerful for me because I'm thinking how confusing. Talk about that. How
Well,
confusing that might have been.
I think for women, this is probably such a familiar thing because I think women are so used to being told, oh, if you only did this one thing, it would be fine. And then someone else coming along and saying, no, don't do that. If you only did this, it would be fine. Or no, don't do that. So, you know, if you, like when women are told to smile more and then people at work don't take them seriously because they're smiling all the time. Or like, I think it's so typical. And this is just another example of that because my father, if you wore anything tight and form-fitting, he would say that was whorish. But if you wore something really loose and then you bent over and it came forward and you could see down the top, then that was obviously really bad too. So there just wasn't, I think for most women, there's not a clothing you can wear that you will not at some point look like a woman. It's just not possible. It's not an achievable goal.
Yeah. And so these two phrases at the end of this, little part I had you read, that you walked around feeling like you were existing in the wrong way. The word whore you associated with yourself, even though you had not even kissed a boy yet. And then you write, it's strange how you give the people you love so much power over you. Sean had defined you to yourself, and there's no greater power than that.
Yeah,
What?
I think so. And I think, part of that scene is they very nearly convinced me that I was pregnant. um, because I didn't know what that involved. I had no sex education. I'd never been to school. My parents had certainly never taught me anything. I had no knowledge myself. So I knew it would be a very bad thing if I were pregnant. But I actually didn't, really, they had me half convinced. I wasn't even defending myself because part of me thought, well, I don't know, maybe I am. I mean, now I can see that's bloody ridiculous. But at the time, I didn't have the information I needed to even know what I was being accused of.